Hola, bienvenidas a todas y todos a una nueva edición o un nuevo día de este mes del diseño en su segunda semana. Tenemos ahora nuestra masterclass de diseño especulativo. No está más recordar que el mes del diseño es una iniciativa del área de diseño del Ministerio de las Culturas, las Artes y el Patrimonio y se realiza anualmente desde el año 2011. Y este 2021 celebra su 10º aniversario, el cual coincide con los 10 años del nacimiento del área de diseño. Se trata de una agenda colaborativa de eventos culturales y educacionales, en donde la academia, los gremios, organizaciones, oficinas, diseñadores y creadores se encuentran para abordar las problemáticas e innovaciones del diseño en Chile, con el objetivo de promover y posicionar el rol de esta disciplina y práctica en nuestra ciudadanía, y que se comprenda el valor como un agente clave de las economías creativas y la preservación del patrimonio, la memoria y la identidad de las sociedades. En esta 10ª versión hemos reflexionado y se presenta el concepto de diseño en tránsito, a través de un completo programa en torno a las rutas de la transformación que está experimentando el diseño como cultura, práctica y disciplina en sus diversas manifestaciones. Es una invitación a pensar y discutir sobre las formas y el valor de diseñar lo que viene, a través de reflexiones sobre nuevos problemas del diseño, los cambios en la práctica de diseñar y las nuevas rutas y fronteras de nuestro sector. Nuestra agenda, que se ha estado desarrollando durante octubre, ha contemplado acciones presenciales y digitales, organizadas por el área de diseño y sumando a las organizaciones aliadas y los profesionales del diseño, docentes y personas interesadas que han querido sumarse en nuestros eventos. Así, este programa se ha completado de masterclass, paneles, vitrinas, cursos y encuentros. Este evento, el de hoy, nuestra masterclass, es parte de la serie de ideas y conversaciones, los tránsitos del diseño con un foco en el futuro y la pregunta por cómo diseñar los futuros posibles. Una de las áreas emergentes del diseño para el futuro es el llamado diseño especulativo, que se entiende como el uso del diseño no para crear cosas, sino que ideas de futuros posibles, empleando esta técnica como instrumento crítico y reflexivo. En esta charla, Paul Neely hará una introducción a esta práctica y ofrecerá un panorama crítico sobre cómo estamos pensando el futuro. Paul Neely es un diseñador e investigador norteamericano, basado en Londres hace ya mucho tiempo, y fundador de la Escuela de Diseño Crítico. Por lo que estuvimos conversando además, creo que habrá mucha gente que lo habrá tenido de tutor o lo conocerá por sus clases y sus tutorías en Londres. Así que esta charla va a ser moderada por Florencia Adriasola, diseñadora académica, vinculada a la integración de escenarios futuros en los métodos de innovación y el valor de la economía creativa. Así que me gustaría que Florencia y Paul Neely prendieran sus cámaras para darles la bienvenida y dejarlos a ellos comenzar la masterclass. Florencia. Hola Florencia, hi. Quiero recordarles a todos los que nos están viendo que tenemos traducción simultánea. Si ustedes ven en Zoom abajo hay un mundo, en ese mundo ustedes podrán encontrar la traducción si quieren verla en inglés o pueden verla en español. Así que muchas gracias por estar acá, es realmente un gusto y los dejo a ustedes en esta masterclass. Gracias.
Gracias Trinidad, buenos días a todos los que están en el hemisferio sur y buenas tardes a quienes están en el hemisferio norte. Voy a hablar en inglés ahora para saludar a nuestro invitado y luego volveré a hablar en español para dar una pequeña introducción sobre él. So, good afternoon to you there in London, Paul, and thank you for being with us today. I will present to you in Spanish now to make it easier to our audience, but as we know, we have simultaneous translation, so it will not be a problem. Anyway, if you need my support in English for any question after the presentation, I will be happy to help you. Okay, then. Voy a comenzar en español, entonces voy a hablar de J. Neely. J. Neely es un diseñador de en diseños de servicios, ha estado involucrado en diseño especulativo, investigación en diseño y estrategia. Ha trabajado profesionalmente en el Centro de Innovación Mayo Clinic, enfocado en la experiencia y la prestación de atención médica en Titan Radiology, realizando soluciones innovadoras de imágenes médicas y en Unilever en Consumer and Market Insights, en el desarrollo de productos. Actualmente su trabajo explora las implicancias sociales, culturales, económicas y éticas de las tecnologías emergentes, diseñando futuros especulativos que nos ayudan a involucrarnos con el concepto de posibilidad como una forma de replantear y comprender nuevamente nuestro estado actual. Sus proyectos recientes se han centrado en el cambio climático, la felicidad, la atención médica, el bienestar, la autocuantificación, la movilidad futura, la inteligencia artificial, la biología sintética y cuestiones de complejidad y reductibilidad computacional en el diseño y los negocios. J. Paul es diseñador de servicios también y diseño especulativo en Neely Worldwide. Es cofundador en Parlia, una empresa financiada por Google DNA y Bloomberg Beta, con la que está creando una enciclopedia de las opiniones del mundo. Enseña en la Escuela de Diseño Crítico, donde se enfoca en experimentar sobre los problemas críticos que enfrentará la humanidad durante los próximos 1000 años, y dirige Masamichi Souso, una organización que trabaja en la optimización de la felicidad a través de la consideración de todo. Es autor en Service Design en el Royal College of Art y ha sido profesor invitado y crítico en el Imperial College, en Computer Science, también en el Royal College, en Design Interactions, en RASD, Architectural Association, Diploma 12, in NYU, ITP, Corn International Design School, and SBA para innovación social. J. Paul tiene una maestría en interacción de diseño en el Royal College of Art, donde se graduó con distinción y estudió con Tony Dunn y Fiona Raby, además de haberse graduado en Northwestern University de estudios en comunicación con especialización en economía. So now, I will leave the floor for you to begin, J. Paul.
Great. Thank you so much, Florencia. Thank you, Trinidad. And I'm really excited to be here with all of you today and to share some of these ideas around speculative design. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you. I'm going to pull up my slides to talk to you a little bit today with a few ideas. And first is speculative design normalization, and the idea that these practices are worthwhile to every designer, to every industry, to every type of organization. So they should be normalized and recognized and used everywhere. But also that we have an ethical imperative to use these practices. We have a responsibility to the future that requires us to use these types of tools in our work. So thank you for that introduction, but just as a quick recap, I do have this nice duality. I get to teach and work with very bright students in business and industry and at the Royal College of Art on projects. But then I also am a practitioner, so working with business and industry and government to see how these apply. So I enjoy the theory and the practice. And in my own practice at Neely Worldwide, I work with a lot of different industries to try to create meaningful impact. I've worked on the world's first virtual hospital, a beautiful building, all with doctors and nurses providing remote care to hospitals around the US. I've worked with the UK government to look at moving from treatment of homelessness to prevention of homelessness, and have done speculative design work with Microsoft and Honda and Google X and others. All to say, I've had a number of opportunities to see how the work applies in different industries and settings. And it's given me reason to believe it's very valuable. So the question I get very excited about is, how can we better understand and create the future? And so today we'll give a brief introduction to speculative design. We'll try to answer the question, can speculative design create real value? And then finally close with the ethical imperative, the reason this work is so important. So the definition of speculative design, I say that it is the design of future products and services to explore the implications of emerging technology or social and cultural trends. So I'm not so much interested in the technology itself, but I'm interested in the effects, the implications of the technology. And speculative design lets us explore that. I'll share a few frames to help understand this. And one is from Tony Dunn and Fiona Rabu, who were my professors at the Royal College of Art. And they introduced the idea of A and B. And A is how design typically operates in the world today, as sort of a slave to industry. And B is asking a question. If we decouple design from industry, if we decouple design from capitalist markets, then we can use our design tools to ask all sorts of interesting questions. And so we have this new world where we are problem finding. Instead of designing for production, we can design for debate. Instead of the consumer, we are the citizen. Instead of making us buy, it can make us think. And so speculative design falls into this B. We're using the techniques outside of the constraints of the current market to learn about the world. Another frame that is very helpful is Amara's law. And Amara's law is the idea, when we look into the future, we tend to think in a linear fashion. But in reality, all technological change and much of social change happens in an exponential fashion. And what this means is, in the near term, we're often disappointed. The technology doesn't work, it will never get there, it's not economically viable, and we dismiss it. But in the medium to long term, there's this inflection point where suddenly we radically underestimate the impact of the technology. So much of my work is spent with governments and organizations to convince them to spend time further out so they're not caught off guard by this inflection point, that they never underestimate the changes that are coming. Another model that many speculative designers use is this idea of future cones. These are cones of possibility or probability. So in the most narrow, we have what are probable futures, the most likely outcomes that will happen. Outside of that are less likely events, but they are plausible. We can believe that this will happen. And at the very edge, it's possible. The events are still possible, but very, very unlikely. And the speculative designer will design many different projects at different degrees of probability and different distances into the future. And we do this to uncover and to understand all of these different possibilities, to sort of illuminate what may happen. And that allows us then to have a conversation together about what is the best outcome, what is the most preferable direction, what do we want to avoid, and what do we want to accelerate towards. Another reason this work is very important is the idea of possibility dilation, that the future is coming at us faster and faster. And the idea is, if you think about the time it took for information to travel around the world, say before the Enlightenment, and then after the printing press was invented, and then after the telephone and after the internet, each time the speed with which we could travel and move information happened much more quickly. And this is very interesting because it allows us to understand all possibilities can come to us very quickly. And so we need to understand all those possibilities. So we don't actually, we're prepared for each outcome. So a few final thoughts on the definition. Speculative design is not fantasy. This is not about magic, but this is about reality. We try to get very close to the scientists or experts to understand what is really possible. It's not utopic or dystopic. It's more about complexity. It's the messy middle where things are good and bad simultaneously, and sometimes we can't tell the difference. It's also about messy people. Many times when companies imagine the future, they think about the perfect customer and someone does everything exactly right. Well, we're very interested in messy people that do things wrong, that are good and bad, they lie, they cheat, but they're also beautiful and loving. So we want to understand how people misuse, misunderstand, or enhance the future. It's not predictive. Some future practices try to guess, 65% chance of this happening. In speculative design, we don't do that. We work in multiples. And if anything is possible, even if it's only 1% possible, it's still interesting to explore because that will give us a new way to see the future. It's very good for emerging technologies or unclear contexts. If we don't know about something, if something is new, speculative design can help us understand what it is. We engage through prototypes in speculative design. So we actually we use our design skills to build pieces of the future so people can touch and feel and experience the future. And that allows people to suspend their disbelief and to believe that something could happen. It's also about generating new answers by asking different kinds of questions. And finally, about creating radical alternatives, reframing the problems by creating new choices. And many times a company, after experiencing speculative design, they realize everything we were worrying about is not useful. There are so many other possibilities and choices to consider. So the practice of speculative design can help us to better explore, understand, and then create the future. But one of the big questions is, is that's a fun exercise, or actually does that have real value in the world? And I think that it can create real value for companies, for governments, for individual organizations. And a few reasons. One is that it uses the same approach that we use today in our other design practices. There's a research phase, then we design something. The only difference is we may not build that thing, but the implementation is in new strategy, new roadmaps, further research, or some product implications. But the process generally of design is the same. The one difference is the time horizon. So instead of being constrained by the near-term needs of the market and what is happening today, we think about maybe 10 years out. If it goes beyond 25 years, sometimes it's difficult for people. It's very disconnected. If it's too close, 2 to 5 years, which is the future for most industries and most companies, that's already happened, basically. It's too near. And so there's sort of a sweet spot at 10 years. The other thing is it fits into a lot of existing practices. So we start with gathering signals about the future or trends, and we generate possible future scenarios, which is very similar to trend and foresight or strategy work that happens at many organizations. Then we build a speculative design. We say, if that future happens, what products and services would exist in that world? And we do something similar to user research. We ask, what are the implications of this? How does this design make us feel? Is this good or bad? How do people react to it? And then finally, we use that learning to create new strategy. What do we do today that is different because we've had this experience in the future? So if I show a more detailed map of that process, we can think about it as an out to the future and then a back to the present. So we start with signals, things that are happening today, a news release, a new technology, a new company, something that happens today that suggests some possibility in the future. We then use a tool like a future wheel to brainstorm on the direct consequences or the indirect consequences of this signal. And we develop possible future scenarios. If it all goes right, if it all goes poorly, somewhere in between. And then we build our speculative designs. We build our products and services that may exist in those worlds. A lot of times that's where it ends. And people are very excited by the shiny future car or the the concept car or the future design, but actually it's only half of the work. Then we really have to spend time to close the loop. We try to research, what are people reacting to these designs? What does it mean? We create learnings and principles from that discussion. We then do an exercise called backcasting. So what are the steps that may help us get to this future or help us avoid this future? What are the interim important moments? And then finally, we say the big question for speculative design is, what do we do today? Because we've had this experience in the future, how does strategy change? How does investment change? Are there implications for our current products and services? What do we stop doing? Right? These are all questions that we should answer based on the future exercise. So I'll give you a few examples of this work. The Extrapolation Factory is Elliot Montgomery, one of my classmates from the Royal College of Art. And in this project, they worked with the New York City Office of Emergency Management. And they imagined with the office, how might infrastructure in the city, like telephone booths and subways, be reused in the case of a bioterror attack. And so in this scene, they've got their you can see in the background, the product there on the wall. And these are actors playing out a scene from the future. And they're doing this in front of all of the leadership of the Office of Emergency Management. And so it's letting them imagine how this might play out. And then they can have a discussion about what we might do differently or what we can learn from this scenario we're watching. The UK Policy Lab is a group that uses design to help the government develop policy. And they have used speculative design to look at smart shipping. So gathering industry leaders around understanding artificial intelligence and automation and other changes to the shipping industry, gathered leaders from industry and from government and civil servants to come together and understand what changes in this world and what, if anything, needs to happen on the policy side to support or protect or avoid negative outcomes. Tellart is a design firm that has done some very interesting work on a project kind of year over year called the Museum of the Future. And they have looked at all sorts of different technologies in that time, but they build very, very large scale, almost museum exhibitions. This is a food printer or a micro garden that you may find in the bottom of an apartment building, where all of the food for the inhabitants of the apartment could be grown. And it lets policymakers come and play and experience and imagine what that future might look like. It makes the future tangible for them. A very great example of this is this little project from Superflux. And this little device creates the air of the future if pollution and climate change are not addressed, if we continue to burn fossil fuels. And the air is predicted to be very toxic and very unpleasant to breathe. And this device lets you breathe what that air might feel like. And it's again, very unpleasant. But this actually helped decision makers to say, I don't want this air for myself. I don't want this air for my children. And sometimes we read in a report, the NO2 level will be this degree and the pollution will be this percentage, but we don't experience it. It's just data. But when we can feel it, when we build a prototype that lets us touch or feel that future, that's very different. Google X and Google have done projects like this. This is one called the Selfish Ledger. This one unfortunately escaped the lab. It was only an internal thinking project. And others, it sort of escaped, and others were uncertain of what it meant if Google was actually trying to do this. but it was really just a piece where they were trying to imagine what are the implications of some of their technology. And just to, I won't go into the details, but just to say that a lot of companies now, speculative design is becoming a regular part of their thinking process and their decision-making process. We worked on one project for Mercedes-Benz with Movil Lab, an internal lab at Mercedes-Benz. And Mercedes-Benz was very good at self-driving cars and had plans to build them. But what they hadn't thought about was the implications for the city and the wider knock-on effects of self-driving cars. So this was a children's book called Where Do Cars Go at Night? And at the beginning of the story, a little boy is dropped off home from school by a self-driving car. And then he asks the car, well, where do you go at night? And the car then tells the story how the car delivers groceries. Her name is Carla 15. She delivers groceries. She cleans the streets. She gets charged and cleaned, and she does ride sharing. And she talks about how the city has changed, how the parking garages are now shops, and etc. But this is a very simple way to create a language around all of the knock-on effects of self-driving cars in the city. And this won a German design award a few years ago. So this work we've done at the RCA with global telecoms companies, with global mobility companies. In my own practice, we've worked with Fortune 500 retailers and global healthcare groups. A lot of the work is all under non-disclosure agreements. It's internal thinking, but that's actually good because it allows us to ask very, very difficult questions, to challenge these organizations, and to kind of be very self-critical of the work that they're doing. It's not something that the marketing department would maybe be happy about seeing, but we can put very difficult decisions in front of leaders, and that's useful. So speculative design can create value for organizations, and in three main ways. We build empathy. We create a tangible future experience. People can touch it. We move away from the applications, the shiny new thing, to implications. What are the impacts of this possible future? And we can interrogate the reactions. How does this make us feel? Are we excited? Are we nervous? Are we sad? Are we concerned? You know, what is this future, and do we want it or do we want to avoid it? It's a creative space. So often I meet teams that, you know, they're not free to think about things outside of the narrow constraints of the market and the narrow constraints of next quarter's results. And so this gives them a place to think in an innovative way, to dream. And it can also create thought leadership because they establish new ways of thinking about the technology when many in an industry or a group have not done that, have not spent time to think about it further into the future. And finally, it ultimately enhances decision-making. It creates a space for discussion, often about difficult questions. It can create perspective in unclear context or a shared language between individuals in the company. It can create radical alternatives. These are your choices today, but if we look at all possibilities, it increases the consideration set. It also lets us triangulate. Instead of one future, we've showed you many possible futures, and it can let us decide where we want to go through all of these futures. And it ultimately, it hedges risk. Because we've thought about not only beautiful outcomes, but some of the worst outcomes and the difficult outcomes, we can work now to avoid those. So I say more, more please. And I think all of you as designers, I hope, you know, can find opportunities in your practice to use speculative design to do those things, to build empathy, enhance decision-making, and create these creative spaces. And not only am I excited about doing it, but I also think we have an ethical imperative. And I think this connects very much with the theme of the Design Week here and all of the talks and discussions you've been having. This idea of transition and of movement into new worlds and new spaces, and even defining practices like design. I think there's a responsibility within all of that for the future. And it becomes an ethical responsibility for us to consider the future in all of that work. So one of the ideas I work a lot with is that anytime we consider anything less than everything, we are missing something. And this means that if we narrow our focus on a particular thing, that's great, but we've really just missed everything else. And so we always need to expand our consideration set, to consider the whole system, to consider the complexity of the world and of people. And part of that is not only considering the complexity today, but also looking at that into the future. And that is part of considering everything, is always keeping the future in mind in our decision making. An example of this, this is the famous designer Alan Cooper. He was responding a few years ago when John Hancock, an American insurance agency, said they will only sell life insurance to individuals who share their Fitbit or their fitness tracker or health data. So if you're tracking your health, your heart rate, your movement on your phone, you have to share that with the company for them to give you insurance. And so he joked, $1 billion startup idea, an Arduino-powered artificial wrist that wears a Fitbit and tells my insurance company I'm doing fine. So it was a funny joke in the moment, but I had already seen this. 10 years before, a classmate, Stefan, right when the first algorithms for detecting movement and detecting walking were coming into the phones, he created this device. And you set your phone in it, and then it will bounce the phone to pretend it's walking, or faster to pretend it's running. He even had one that was a drunken stupor. So the phone kind of wobbles around. But he envisioned this as soon as these algorithms came out, that people would maybe be monitored by work or by health insurance or others for their movement, and that you may want to fake this. And so this idea, is important to understand as early as possible, to then build in to those futures, or understand the implication of those futures. A few years ago, OpenAI refused to release one version of their artificial intelligence because they felt the fake text generator may be too dangerous to release. And for me, this is really tragic, because we're developing things which we've not yet understood the implications of, and don't yet have plans to contain or to mitigate. And so, this should have been understood long before the technology was developed, exactly how we would handle something that was this risky or potentially dangerous. So the speculative design was missed, and we didn't understand what this future meant. And now we've arrived in this future, and it becomes very uncertain. And the biggest one, I think, of all of this is climate change. We have almost 60 years of sort of not listening to scientists, and governments not taking seriously their pledges to reduce emissions. And now we're in sort of a catastrophic moment. I know, all over the world, we're starting to feel the effects of climate change, from drought and floods and more severe storms and fires, and impact on crops. And we've just barely begun. We're not even to 1.5 degrees, and currently we're on track to 2 or even 3 degrees of warming. And the effort it will take to avoid this warming is incredible. And we're seeing people protest and begin to raise the alarm. Groups like Extinction Rebellion are organizing to put pressure on government, and to put pressure on organizations to reduce their emissions. We have the global summit this week, to address some of these issues. But so much needs to be done, and we really are in a climate emergency at this time. An article in the New York Times suggested it's time for catastrophic thinking, that all of these scenarios that were once unimaginable and that we didn't worry about are now actually possibilities. And the very worst outcomes of climate change, some of these things are happening much faster than we anticipated and that the scientists anticipated. And so it's for us to understand them and begin to design our plans to avoid sort of the worst outcomes that are happening. But we have to become very comfortable with understanding what these catastrophes are. So ultimately, the path to reduce these emissions is incredible. 45% reduction in the next 10 years. I think it's an additional 45% by basically net 40 or net zero emissions by 2040, 2050. And some think even that is not fast enough. But what's interesting about this is what that means for us and for transitions happening in the world. And I love this quote. I think there's quite a hopeful thread in all of this. Eric Holthaus is a journalist and kind of thinker on climate change in the States. And he said, if you take this IPCC report literally about the dangers of warming, the decades of the 2020s is about to be the most important years in all of humanity. We're about to enter one of the most creative, meaningful, transcendent eras in human history simply because we must. If we're to avoid the worst outcomes of warming, it will be a complete reimagining of everything. There's no industry, there's no way of living, there's no company, there's no global supply chain, there's no food style or way of living that isn't touched by the changes that will need to be made. And so I'm very excited about those shifts, and I believe that we can make those changes, and I believe in our sort of creativity, and I believe in design as an approach that can support all of these different organizations and groups and industries and citizens and people to make the changes that are necessary. In all of our projects at Neely Worldwide, we always include this slide, no matter if we're working in healthcare or on telecommunications. We always include this slide in the report, that whatever you're doing now is probably not as important as addressing global warming, to put everything in this context of this challenge. So William Gibson, the science fiction writer, said that all imagined futures lacking recognition of anthropogenic climate change will increasingly seem absurdly short-sighted, and we'll seem that they have utterly missed the single most important thing we're doing with technology. Climate change is so big that you can't imagine any future where this doesn't impact it in some way. And it becomes increasingly important that that's built into all of our thinking of the future and of today. So that the kind of final thought is, I really believe in this speculative design, where we decouple from industry and use design to ask questions about the future. But I'd add, this is my little addition, is C, that we also use design then to close the loop and to act today, so that we can move from in the service of society to in the service of everything, including nature. From moving from implications to impact, from design for debate to design for survival, and from sort of making us think to making us act, from provocation to restitution. So this is my real hope, that we can use speculative design to act and to create meaningful impact by understanding better the future, and then working today to create that future. So I want to thank all of you very much, and I'm very excited for the discussion to come. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you, J. Paul, for this presentation. I believe we are all excited by your knowledge and work in the field that you have shared with us today. We have some Q&A space now, and I will start by asking a few questions of my own and from those submitted by the audience. Then we will take any additional questions that may come from the listeners to create a stimulating discussion. I will turn to Spanish again to ask these questions and make it easier for the listeners we have today from different cities of Chile and other countries like Argentina, Puerto Rico, Peru, Mexico, Venezuela, and Spain. Así que comenzaré con algunas preguntas que derivan de reflexiones y cuestiones que para mí son inevitables de considerar frente a esta área del diseño. Bueno, quisiera referirme un poco a lo último que mencionaste, vinculado a Tony Dunn y Fiona Raby, autores de Speculative Everything, libro que tiene ya casi 9 años y que probablemente varios de la audiencia pueden conocer. En él, ellos exponen esta necesidad de plantear un diseño menos restringido por el mercado, inspirado en parte por estudios posmodernos de los 60 y 70, como Archigram, Archizoom, Superstudio, entre otros. Sin embargo, yo me pregunto si crees que hoy, y parte de eso ya fuiste mencionando, debiésemos agregar o pudiéramos cambiar algo a esa visión de Tony y Fiona. ¿O tú ves nuevas inspiraciones que modifican la forma en que se planteó el diseño especulativo desde ellos o en ese momento?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think that there are sort of many places where speculative design can exist. And it emerged, in these very creative practices, going back, as you mentioned. And I think Tony and Fiona, much of their work is rooted in this deep academic space. Their work is shown in galleries, and it's very provocative and cutting edge, and working with experts to really understand the edges of the theory. And I think that is excellent and essential, very important. The piece I'm trying to add is that while it can exist there and creates very valuable discussions, there is also an opportunity to apply the technique in industry, in business, in government, that we can also use those same approaches to help our decision making in these other places. So I think it's not an or, I think it's an and, that it exists in the theory, and their, without their work, I can't do the work I do in industry. And we learned there's that great loop from academia and the gallery and the artist, and then the application in industry and then the response. So I think that loop is very important. So this is hopefully adding to that and showing another space where we can use speculative design.
Creo que es una excelente respuesta porque de hecho tenía una pregunta que la quise saltar desde tu perspectiva, que me parece distinta a la de Tony y a la de Fiona, porque cuando uno ve el trabajo de ellos, uno se pregunta un poco si existía una diferencia en la forma en que un artista plástico o visual podía enfrentar el desarrollo de escenarios futuros versus el trabajo que podía plantear un diseñador especulativo. O sea, cómo enseñamos desde la disciplina del diseño. Por eso creo que me fascina la respuesta. Y no sé si tú quisieras agregar algo a eso, pero esto de las galerías que mencionabas de Tony y Fiona me parece que aparece también mucho en la forma en que ellos se acercan al diseño especulativo.
Yeah, so it's very much about who the audience is. Who are we designing to communicate with? Is it a public in a gallery setting where it may verge to a little more artistic or theoretical? And what the aspects of design often come from that audience. So for me, sometimes my design looks like, I will work in PowerPoint because the group I'm working with, the whole company talks in PowerPoint. So we will build our speculative design in the material that the company knows best, or the language that the company knows best. But I will say that Tony and Fiona, when we studied with them, they were very serious about there is no style to this. This is our style, this is our look that we appreciate, but there's no aesthetic requirement for speculative design. So using whatever materiality, if I'm a video designer, or if I'm a potter, or a ceramicist, or I'm an illustrator, all of those disciplines will render different futures, and all of those are valuable. It's just about who is the audience, and what are we trying to explore.
Bueno, gracias por la respuesta. Alguien en la audiencia preguntó si usabas el diseño especulativo en la academia y cómo lo usabas. Y claro, dada tu biografía que vimos en la introducción, se deduce que sí lo enseñas. Pero me imagino que la pregunta que pretende que puedas desarrollar un poco más sobre cómo es tu trabajo académico en esta área, y tal vez tus objetivos en los cursos, o quizás los puntos que consideras interesantes de compartir en relación a tu desempeño como docente en este campo.
Yeah. So one of the interesting things that's happened at the Royal College of Art is where design interactions, the course I studied on, was very focused on speculative design. Now that what was kind of a silo, that course is no longer taught, but actually every course in the RCA has this thread of the future. So I've worked with the fashion department on the future of fashion. I've worked with, we've done projects with banking and service design. We've done projects with engineering on, mobility. And so it's a realization that these practices about designing the future and understanding those implications of emerging technology, that is not limited. Every industry, every course potentially has that space. Interestingly, Tony and Fiona now do a lot of work with philosophers or social scientists. So they're exploring the entire university, applying these design aspects to completely different disciplines. So that's, I think, very interesting for me. Much of my work in the university now is sort of about introductions. For a fashion student, how do they begin to understand speculative design, and how can it become a part of their practice? So it's more about, again, the normalization. How does everyone have this tool set available to them?
Gracias. Voy a hacer otra pregunta. O quizás volviendo en realidad a la pregunta anterior. Podríamos darle otra interpretación a esa pregunta, quizás. Pensando en si has usado el diseño especulativo para imaginar cómo será la academia en el futuro, y si lo has hecho, ¿cuáles han sido tus principales hallazgos?
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, that's a really good question. And boy, anyone who works in academia knows that this is a space that needs a lot of reimagining. So, but we have done projects like that, looking at what new types of education will look like. I don't know that I can say, particular aspects that emerge from that, but a few points, or I guess signals, maybe things that are happening now that I think are very interesting is one is this decentralization, this global networking that we can do to share information and learning in these spaces like Zoom and virtual spaces. I think that's very interesting. I think will continue. The other thing I think is happening a bit is which I think is wonderful, is the gatekeeping is disappearing. I hope one of the things in the future is much more about your skill. We say that the designer is only as good as their last design. And rather than a piece of paper from an institution that says you're certified, we can allow anyone to participate, and we judge them based on their work. So I'm excited by other types of online learning platforms that let anyone take these classes from anywhere in the world. So yeah, no specific mind-blowing insights, but I do think a big reimagining is necessary in education.
Alguien también, un poco como en la misma línea, pregunta, ya no solo en la academia, sino cuáles son tus ideas de futuro con respecto al diseño gráfico y al diseño como disciplina en general.
Yeah, so that's interesting. I've had an experience to ride kind of 3 waves of design interest. So one with design thinking, where design thinking was suddenly very exciting, and all the companies needed to have design thinkers. And then they sort of realized it's very difficult to teach people to do design. That design expertise comes from experience, and so maybe we should hire some experts. And I saw the same thing happen with service design. When we started the service design course at the Royal College of Art, when I started in the US, I was one of the only service designers. And we just, there were no courses. We just began to explore the approach and the mindset. And now, our designers at the RCA from service design, they're hired by banks, by the government, different institutions. But 7 years ago, that no one had heard of service design. And I think speculative design is the same sort of wave. So I guess if there's anything for the industry, I think it's these continued cycles of the world learning the value of design, and maybe some sort of distribution of that idea, but then a return to the expert. That actually, even in this, there's huge value in expertise. So I think that maybe in design in general, in graphic design, it's interesting. 2 thoughts specifically. One, some of the best service designers we teach often come from service design or from graphic design backgrounds, and we think it's because of their ability to visualize. And so they can take a complex system, and they're very used to taking a lot of complex information and making it visually understandable. And so that particular skill is incredibly valuable. So that is very interesting to me as I think we start to move towards systems design and towards understanding of larger and larger complex organizations and structures. I think graphic design continues to, and visualization continues to play a more important role. The other thing that's interesting to me with graphics particularly is the mediums that we're in now. So, in all visual spaces, in physical spaces, but in digital spaces, in virtual spaces, and the sort of translation of information across all of these, it becomes, I think of critical importance. But yeah, that's an interesting question to think about.
Sí, estoy totalmente de acuerdo con lo que mencionas. De hecho, bueno, quisiera también llevarte un poco como a la idea del contexto latinoamericano. Y voy a hablar un poquito también de lo que mencionaste, de esta idea del valor que tenemos como diseñadores de darle forma visual a las ideas de futuro. Con respecto a esto, quisiera decir que como consultora dentro del contexto latinoamericano he podido utilizar ejercicios de diseño especulativo, pero para guiar etapas iniciales de innovación. Y he visto el valor que tiene para ayudar a los participantes para que de algún modo puedan pensar de una manera más abierta o atrevida, que tanto nos cuesta en Latinoamérica. Generalmente preferimos la innovación, nos cuesta la innovación radical, preferimos la innovación que en el fondo es la reinterpretación de lo que ya existe, ¿ya? Pero por otro lado también, como tú mencionabas, creo que el aporte que nuestra disciplina genera a visualizar futuros escenarios de manera gráfica o un prototipo para una empresa que busca tener una mirada sobre el futuro es muy significativa. Sin embargo, pareciera que el uso de estas técnicas o estos métodos suelen integrarse en ambientes que valoran, o en empresas, por ejemplo, que valoran la realización de planificación de escenarios a corto o mediano plazo, es decir, más el diseño más cercano a la previsión, la estrategia o el forecasting, que el diseño especulativo. Les cuesta más el diseño especulativo. Que los invita a pensar en futuros más lejanos. Así que mi pregunta es, en contextos más restringidos, como para nosotros convencer a estas compañías del valor del diseño especulativo, cuesta un poco más en los países en vías de desarrollo. Es decir, se vuelve un poco más complejo, donde se tiende a mirar a corto plazo. ¿Y tú crees que el diseño especulativo es más difícil de desarrollar en contextos como estos, donde las restricciones son más limitadas que en países desarrollados que tienen más recursos?
Yeah, I think that's a very good observation. And it's the same in companies. In a company that is very resource restricted and maybe has very, very short purview, next quarter's results, it's very difficult to say, hey, let's come and think about 10 years out. But there's still really important value there. and many of the opportunities for them will unlock when they're no longer focused on just the short term. For example, it's one of the reasons I really believe in universal basic income, because I think so much human potential is locked up because people are struggling for their basic needs. But once you provide for those basic needs, once that's no longer a concern, then you're free. There's this opening up of exploration. So in these restricted contexts, I suggest a sort of stealth speculative design. You have to sneak it in. So if you're doing a new product, you're trying to think of new product, well, let's do a brainstorm, but let's just do a little bit of brainstorm about 10 years out into the future. And if we're doing user research, well, let's just show the users one of the concepts from the future and see their reaction. And so I see in not just strategy and foresight, but also in any product development, in any research where you're getting reactions from the public, those are places where you sneak in a little bit of speculative design, a little bit of future focus to create value. And it's the same, I remember, with service design. You couldn't tell someone, hey, let's do service design. Nobody knew what you were talking about. So you say, well, we're going to work on this product, but we're just going to also look at the whole system, if it's okay. And sure, that makes sense. And it's the same thing here. I think in resource restricted contexts, we just acknowledge that, and then we find the way that it becomes appropriate. We find the language it becomes appropriate. We find the right level of engagement where it's appropriate, but it can still provide value even in those very short-term decision-making contexts.
Sí, totalmente. Me recordaste otra cosa, cuando pienso en diseño de servicios, porque a mí también me toca hacer diseño de servicios, y creo que tiene con el diseño especulativo esta idea de manejar la frustración o la expectativa de cuando hay un cliente, sobre todo de por medio, en un proceso largo, y el resultado final a veces no es tan concreto como el diseño industrial o gráfico, que claro, termina en un prototipo que luego funciona directamente. Entonces, bueno, es un comentario. Pero quisiera también, en el fondo, hacerte otra pregunta que me parece que nace de la anterior y que va en la misma dirección. Te voy a poner incómodo nuevamente, porque creo que hay una de las cosas que me inquieta también como latina o desde otro lugar del mundo. Generalmente las visiones de futuro suelen venir de culturas dominantes, y también lo voy a vincular con, hay alguien aquí en el chat que también pregunta algo vinculado. y del mundo desarrollado. Y muchas veces esas visiones se establecen como universales, ¿ya? Que es un poco lo que tú mencionaste con Fiona y Tony también. Por lo que te pregunto si crees significativo considerar aspectos culturales en las visiones de futuro, o piensas en realidad que no es relevante hacerlo.
I think it's very relevant, very relevant, and absolutely critical to have these different perspectives in the world. This idea of sort of parallel futures, or many futures happening at once, is really important. Also, that the future is here; it's just not evenly distributed. That applies kind of constantly. The future in one country is the past in another, is the future in another, is the present in another. So I think everyone and every culture, are experiencing things in different ways at different timings, and so that cultural aspect is really important. I think sometimes the criticism is a little unfair. That I've seen, for example, Tony and Fiona criticized in the past, well, that this view, is this one future. And I don't think they ever said, we are responsible for all futures. This is our practice in our particular context. So my call, which I think is critical, is we need more people participating. And we need the global South. We need that voice. We need the voice from China. We need to see those futures. We need to see kind of the uniqueness that comes from those perspectives and culture. With the School of Critical Design, we've been running a series on the global South and having some speakers, designers from Mexico and Colombia and Argentina and other places, talk about their practice. And it's very interesting for me because I'm, hearing things, for example, about how time is perceived very differently to Europe, and these are really important cultural ideas that everyone can learn so much from. So I agree, culture is critical. We need many voices in understanding what the future looks like. And I think I'm very excited, for this talk and for other type of work to see more speculative design, more visions of the future, coming from many different parts of the world. But there's a critical voice that needs to be heard from the global South.
Sí, ahí tomé un poco esta idea de una pregunta que hizo Marco Gutiérrez, que hablaba de esta herramienta poderosa como un nuevo medio para, lo decía, como grandes empresas que del norte global colonicen el futuro, ¿ya? Y cómo evitamos esa inequidad. Yo creo también, no sé, y ahí respondo yo un poquito, pero me parece importante también como lo que tú también mencionaste en un momento, que es la etnografía de futuros. Ahí como de Texton, hay un autor que habla de la etnografía de futuros. Pero me pareció interesante esa pregunta. Así que bueno, ahora quisiera preguntarte sobre otra pregunta que tiene que ver con... alguien también mandó esta pregunta, y dice, ahora quisiera referirme un poco como a una pregunta en realidad que fue enviada durante el proceso de inscripción y que dice si crees que es posible utilizar el diseño especulativo en pequeñas empresas o en inglés es small, en pymes dice, que es como small and medium-sized enterprises. O al contrario, ¿crees que el diseño especulativo es más posible en grandes compañías que tienen más visión de futuro a veces, quizá?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think it can apply in any size company. And again, often in a smaller company, we don't have as much time or expertise or resource, but even, a half day or a few hours spent thinking in this way can create some value. I've worked with some companies where we did a workshop for one day and we created a few prototypes, very, very simple prototypes. but those prototypes had a huge impact on the conversations within the, the SME, because you've made tangible, some concern of the business or some abstract idea about the future. And now everyone has an artifact to point to and to talk about. And I'll come back 2 years later, and you still see that in a slide talking about the future, changed in some way. So I don't think it has to be a very expensive process. I think it can be done very, very simply. And again, using just the principles and using whatever skill set you have to render that future, that's enough. As long as you create the space for the conversation, you have an opportunity for new value. I mean, the other way to think about it is most companies are doing zero, no thinking about the future whatsoever, or their future is 2 years. So if you spend any time, even 2 hours on this approach, you already will have radically expanded the consideration set in the company. And that's very interesting. So I think it can be done very, very cheaply, very inexpensively. And even in, an individual's life, I think it's an interesting practice. What does your personal future hold? Speculate on your own life. I think it's just that approach of using our design skills in another future context, and that's very interesting.
Muy interesante tu respuesta. También estoy muy de acuerdo. En la misma línea, pero un poco distinta, alguien pregunta si tú crees que funciona mejor el diseño especulativo en organizaciones públicas o organizaciones internacionales que las compañías privadas. Que es similar. Quizás esta pregunta debió ir antes que la anterior, pero...
Yeah, I think it can work in both, and very well. The one trick in the private sector is that, many times we want to explore very difficult or ugly futures, and it's one of my joys as a consultant is I can come in and often, say some very harsh things to the company about climate change, about, how I feel their interactions are with society, other issues like polarization. And maybe it's difficult for an employee within the company to speak that type of criticism, but the futures gives us a place to make those challenges. So the trick then being that many times those types of futures where they're critical of the company or of the world, the public would never see those because it's not something the company wants to be associated with. In the public sphere, I think it's a chance to be much more open, and where all of those, positive and negative and complex, all of those futures can be seen. So I've seen it used successfully in both places. And again, the form of the practice may change. My practice is very focused on organizations and government. But for example, the Extrapolation Factory, I think almost all of their work is public facing, and charitable institutions, and completely, they want all of their work and those conversations to be in the public domain, which I think is really valuable as well. And the other thing I'd say is it's an emerging domain and discipline. So I'm always very excited when a designer comes to me and says, hey, we tried it here, and hey, I tried it here, and hey, I modified it, but it kind of worked here. So we're all learning. There's no right answer, I think, at this point.
Ya, bueno, estamos un poco en el tiempo, pero me gustaría, hay como dos preguntas que quedan aquí dando vuelta. Hay muchas preguntas, me siento muy mal por algunas que las veo muy buenas, pero quisiera en el fondo preguntarte, entendiendo el momento crucial en el que estamos viviendo, y el legado que debiésemos dejar y que haga trascender más allá incluso el tiempo que nos toca vivir. Estoy pensando en el cambio climático. Me pregunto si crees que ¿por qué crees que nos cuesta tanto? Y también Antonia Necochea lo mencionaba en relación a los alumnos. Yo creo que también, como con todos, hay una persona que pregunta en relación a los alumnos. ¿Por qué nos cuesta tanto imaginar futuros que van más allá de lo cercano? O diseñar quizás no para nosotros ya, sino como para trascender en algo que va más allá del tiempo que nos toca vivir, incluso cuando tú mencionas que diseñas pensando en 1000 años, o imaginas futuros en 1000 años.
Yeah, I think it takes practice to imagine the future. You're right. Our current problems and our current context, we're sort of not built to throw out everything we know and imagine something that's different. We're designed to understand what is and try to act within it. And I think that's why design has something valuable to add, because there is a creativity in this discipline, you know, and there is an ability to make tangible in this discipline. So if design can contribute and make ways for people to see these futures, touch the futures, they have a better chance at imagining, you know, what could be. So again, I don't think we have enough thinking about the future, and I don't think we do enough work to make the future tangible for people to imagine something, you know, something else. And so, yeah, that's my hope. Particularly in this moment, we need much better visions of what could be, and we need to understand, you know, have visions of how we can get there. So it's difficult work, and it takes practice, but I think design can be a great asset to the public, to other kinds of institutions, as we try to imagine what could be.
Bueno, estamos, la verdad, ya con el tiempo pasado, pero la verdad es que es fascinante, yo lo considero totalmente fascinante. Quiero agradecer la participación de todos ustedes hoy. Tenemos muchas preguntas que quedaron ahí, me hace sentir muy mal porque son muchas y traté de decir varias de ellas. Well, thank you so much. It has been a pleasure to have you here with us today.
Well, please reach out, and I hope to continue the conversation with everyone. So yeah, I would love to field those questions if people want to email or reach out. But thank you so much, Florencia and Trinidad and everyone there. It's been a real treat to have this conversation.
Muchas gracias a ti, Jean-Paul, de verdad ha sido muy interesante y como dice Florencia, creo que vamos a invitarte más y ojalá presencial, tenerte acá y poder seguir profundizando este tema porque realmente es algo que nos llama, nos convoca y que somos responsables, ¿no? de generar estas conversaciones y estos cambios. Quiero agradecerles a todas y todos por estar acá. Tenemos ahora otra masterclass, es una masterclass de diseño y arte, en donde estaremos con otros británicas, con Alice Black. Ella es la exdirectora del Design Museum de Londres, es gestora cultural y experta en economía creativa británica, y la doctora Helga Schmidt, quien es diseñadora, artista, investigadora y educadora, con quienes estaremos conversando junto a Constanza Well sobre este cruce de disciplinas y cuáles son las plataformas y las formas de vinculación dentro de estos nuevos futuros y transformaciones. Así que muchas gracias a todos y nos vemos en 15 minutos a quienes quieran estar con nosotros. Todas las masterclass y todas las presentaciones quedarán registradas y grabadas en el YouTube de Economía Creativa del Ministerio de las Culturas. Lo buscan como EC o Economía Creativa Chile y lo pueden encontrar. Así que desde esta tarde podemos repetir, si ustedes quieren, se pueden repetir esta gran masterclass.